this time.
Alrighty. Here with Al Lucas.
Howdy.
Could you just start with telling us your position, what you do?
Yep. So my name's Al Lucas, as you said. I'm the Director of Legislative Services for the New Haven Board of Alders. New Haven Board of Alders is our city council. It's the legislative body for the city of New Haven. And my position basically is the chief of staff position. So when people ask me what I do, I tell them whatever they ask me to do. Do a little bit of everything. Draft legislation, set up meetings with public officials, set up meetings with residents around issues in neighborhoods, whatever it is that needs to be done, other public officials from other towns, whatever we can do to help. So that's what I do.
Gotcha. So can you explain your role in the voting process and as well as the city hall as a whole's role in the voting process?
Sure. So our office is the Board of Alders office. We staff the elected officials. The elected officials on election day are usually out at the various polling places. So if people have problems on election day, they'll call our office. Or if the elected officials see problems on election day, they'll call our office to try to get us to help with it because they're out in the field during the actual election process. Also, our space is used on election day for what is now called election day registration, EDR for short. Connecticut's one of the few states where people are actually allowed to register and vote the same day as an election. So in order to do that, most people have a central location in their town that they can go to, in their town hall, in our case in City Hall. And that happens to be the space that is our space, meaning the space that the Board of Alders uses. So both our meeting rooms and our large chamber are used for election day registration purposes. And then what our office does is just support. The Registrar of Voters office is the office that's in charge of elections for the city. But we just support them on that day by doing whatever we can to support and try to let people know what's going on.
Right. So can you kind of walk me through what a normal resident would do in registering to vote and then casting their ballot on election day? Kind of what goes into that beforehand as well as on election day?
So if you do everything before the deadline, Connecticut has an actual deadline. I know it sounds a little weird because we have election day registration, but we also have a deadline to register. So there's actually a deadline to register for voting. And with that, if you register in time for that deadline, you will show up on a list at a polling place. So you'll go to that polling place, you will tell them your name, they will check you off on the list, and they will give you a ballot. You will fill it out, stick it in the machine, get your little I voted today sticker, and you'll be on your way. If for some reason you show up at the polling place and that's not the case, you think you've registered to vote and you are not on the list, then one of two things can happen. We have what's called provisional ballots where they may allow you to vote there that day, or they will send you down to City Hall and say you need to go down there to resolve whatever your issue might be. Find out what it is and get it resolved. So that's one group of people that shows up on election day registration, people who tried to vote at their polling place and for some reason they weren't on the list, and so they end up coming down to City Hall. The other group of people that's coming down are people that have not registered at all yet and have decided they want to participate in this particular election. And so they will show up at City Hall and we will have set up in the rooms there people who will verify that they're not already registered. They will make sure that they haven't, if they are registered and they're transferring, say from West Haven or Hamden to New Haven, to make sure that they haven't voted already. And then they will enter them with the new information into the system. Once that's done, they're given information that tells them where their new polling place will be going forward. And they're sent to our big chamber to go vote just like they would vote at a regular polling place. And they'll get the ballot that is associated with their particular new polling place to vote for that particular day.
Right. So you mentioned how there was deadline to register pre-election, and then there's also a same-day election. So what do you think is the purpose of having people register beforehand if people are just going to say, oh, I can just go and register the same day as the election?
It's really the purpose of having them register beforehand is really for them for their ease on election day, because if they register beforehand, they're going to be told where their actual polling place is, and that polling place is going to be somewhere near where they actually live, as opposed to if they show up on election day and they come down to City Hall, they have to trek all the way down to City Hall to do that, and they could be coming from any part of town, from the furthest parts away from town to do that. They may have childcare issues, they may have class, they may have all sorts of other issues. And when we get on election day, as we did this year, when you have lots of people that show up, that means there's long, long waits. And you really don't want people to have to wait for a long, long time to vote. You really want people to be able to show up at the polling place, check in, cast their ballot, and go on about their day. So the point of having the regular deadline process is to make it easier for the voter.
Right. So how was the turnout this year at City Hall in terms of numbers, wait time, lines this year at City Hall?
Right. So there's been a lot of news about that. We had a very long wait time. We had a lot of people. We registered over 800 people at City Hall on this election day, just through the election day registration process. We did that in 12 hours. So not only did we have to have these people register, but we also had to have them vote. So they had to register and vote within that 12-hour period. And on average, it was taking about 4 hours for people from the time they showed up to the time they actually got to cast their ballot. And so we had a lot of long waits,
Right. So with that, there was something that came out on social media, on Facebook. With the,
how exciting.
I'll just read you what the post says. It says, overseeing voter suppression at City Hall, Al Lucas and other City Hall workers turning away hundreds of voters. Photos taken at 3:30 p.m. and 5 p.m. and attached are two images. One of them says, wait time is approximately 4 hours. Polls close at 8 p.m. Please consider no guarantee you will be able to vote if you arrive after 4 p.m. So can you kind of touch on this? Was voters actually being turned away at City Hall?
Yeah, absolutely. No voters got turned away at City Hall. Everybody that wanted to vote got to vote. But as we said, there were long wait times. There were people that were, on average, people were waiting 4 hours. So at about 3:30-ish, we decided it was important to let people know that if they were arriving after 4 o'clock and there's a 4-hour wait time, that's going to be a problem. Because in Connecticut, if you are not a registered voter and in line by 8 o'clock, you are not going to be able to vote that day. And in the past, just in the last presidential election, we had this issue where people showed up at like 7:45 thinking they were going to be able to vote because they were in line at 7:45 to vote, but they weren't registered yet. And if you're a registered voter in line before 8 o'clock, then the polls have to stay open until you vote. But you have to be a registered voter. And so the first part of this process is getting you to be a registered voter. And it was taking about 4 hours for people from the time they arrived to the time they became a registered voter. So at about 3:30, we realized we were going to have an issue. We had a line of about 100 people. It's taken about 4 hours. Anybody that's coming in after this, it's going to be risky. So we felt it was important to let people know that and to be respectful of people's time and let them know, we want you to stay, we want you to vote, we're going to do everything we can to get you to be able to vote, but we can't guarantee it. And so you need to be aware of that. We also let voters know that if they were from another town, maybe they were already registered in another town, that it might actually be faster for them to go to their actual polling place in their actual town if they could get there than to wait for 4 hours to shift over registration. So at about 4 o'clock, we started calling the Secretary of State's office, Secretary of State in Connecticut controls all elections. We started calling them, letting them know we have an issue. We know that right now we have people that are lined up to register to vote, and they're not going to be able to do it unless we get some help. So at the time, we only had 2 people processing, putting people into the state database. You have to be deputized to do that. So we needed to deputize a bunch of additional people to do it. And we needed equipment to actually process the people to do it. And we were able eventually to get all that to happen. But so everybody that wanted to vote and stayed was able to vote. But it took a lot of work, it took a lot of phone calls on our part to make that happen.
Right. So do you think that the long wait lines, the signs, and all that were present at the voting place, do you think that discouraged anybody from voting?
I don't think so. I think that, again, we were there encouraging everyone, stay. We're trying to work on it. We're trying to get more people here. We're doing what we can. We're calling the state. We're trying to figure out how to make this work. We may have to call it. We even talked about having to call a judge to potentially try to extend the hours for the voting. It was going to be a close election between the 2 gubernatorial candidates, so we knew that whichever party thought that this was going to be to their disadvantage was not going to be cooperative if we went to a judge and asked for an extension, but we were trying that as well. And so we were encouraging everybody to stay. There were also a bunch of student coalitions that were there that were doing the same thing. Some of them brought pizza to the polling place and gave pizza out. Some other activists came and got Starbucks to donate little shots of coffee for people. One young lady who was there started a yoga class, impromptu yoga class that was there. So there was a lot of camaraderie between the people who were there and in the line, and all the officials that were there were trying to figure out what can we do to make sure that everybody that's here gets to vote. And we were not trying to have anyone be discouraged about it. But we did want to be honest with people about the reality of the situation. Until we got authorization or more people, it was going to be a problem that everybody that was coming in potentially after 4 o'clock potentially was at risk of not being able to vote.
Right. So obviously New Haven is a very diverse community, but it's also a community that's filled with a lot of African American people, minority people. I want to share a stat with you on kind of a lot of the issues that are going on with voter suppression. It says 15% of Americans who earn less than $35,000 a year do not have a government-issued ID, and we know you need a government-issued ID to register to vote at the polls and stuff like that. So with New Haven being a community that's predominantly black, what do you have to say about the laws that are in place that might discourage African Americans from voting or limit them from having the opportunity to vote?
Well, it's interesting because in Connecticut that's not required. So people will ask you for ID, but as long as you have something that shows your residency, that demonstrates who you are, you're good in Connecticut. And we actually had some people. Now, election day registration is a little different because you are trying to register and vote that same day. So it gets a little stricter that day, which is why you want people, again, to register ahead of time. So, for example, in Connecticut, if I am doing a voter registration drive, you fill out a card and I send it and I mail it in. I don't mail in a copy of your government issued ID. The Secretary of State's going to verify some of this information. And it's the same thing that on election day with election registration that people are doing. They're verifying some of your information that you're giving, mostly that you haven't voted already. So in Connecticut, that's not really an issue. Now there are people who work at polling places who don't know that and will still ask you for ID. And most people will give it if they have it, but it's not a requirement. But that doesn't change the bigger issue nationwide that you're really addressing, which is about which goes all the way to what we call poll taxes, meaning people historically there were methodologies that were put in place to try to discourage people from voting. Some of it economic, by saying you have to buy something or have enough money to be able to get something in order to be able to vote, or by trying to give strange quizzes to people saying you have to know, every word in the preamble of the Constitution in order for us to be able to register you to vote. In Georgia, just this year, the Secretary of State there, who won as governor, decided that he was going to erase people from the rolls of their election database if there was any misspelling of their name. So if you did have a government issued ID and your name was spelled differently, maybe you're Michelle with 2 L's, but on the voter rolls you were Michelle with 1 L, he was erasing you off the voter rolls because that's not the same person. And so there are efforts underway across the country to try to dissuade and to try to manipulate the law in ways to get disenfranchised communities from using their franchise. And we're very keenly aware of that. And so there's efforts across the country to work on that. We need people. So on election day, some of the people that were even in City Hall on election day were election observers who were all around the country, but were looking for those types of issues. Oh, is there something strange going on? Is there are people trying to discourage that? The spirit of the post that you read from Facebook came out of that type of movement, that they're looking for things that might be happening, issues that might be arising that are trying to keep people from voting. But in Connecticut, it's the exact opposite, especially in New Haven. I mean, we're trying to do everything we can to get as many people registered and voting as possible. And we will continue to do that. So, but yeah, those issues about what kind of ID do you need? How do you get ID? What does it cost to get ID? Those types of things, especially in communities where they're not that prevalent, can become a tool that can be used for one side or the other.
Right. So you spoke about how a lot of times, or how sometimes there might be somebody who's working at the poll who might not be educated in the fact of whether you need ID, whether you don't need ID. Do you think that there's something that the state can do, or that the city can do to better prepare these people who are working at the polling institutions to just so they can serve the public better?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a conversation we constantly have. There's training that both the state and the city do. Each polling place has what we call a moderator. It's a person that's in charge. So if there is an issue, there's a go-to person there to resolve it. But you also have to have the person who is affected being willing to challenge what's happening. So there's an educational component on both sides. There's an educational component that we have to do for voters to make sure that voters understand what the actual rules are and that they don't just take the word of someone who's just sitting there, and that the people who are sitting there also know what's going on. Most of the people you have that are working polling places are folk that are volunteers. This is not their profession. This is just something they volunteer on election day. They're just doing this. They give back. It's a civic act that they do. They enjoy it. They enjoy participating in the voting process for one day a year or a couple of days a year. And so it is important that we do that. It's a conversation we've had here with our registrar of voters about making sure that the people who work in the polling places are aware of what is actually allowed and not. But it's also, I think we can always do more with that, and especially letting people know that it's okay for them to challenge what they're being told at the polling place. And in New Haven, because we have election day registration, the worst thing that's going to happen is they're going to send you down to City Hall to resolve your issue, and you'll be able to vote there. But you have to be willing to actually do that. And we just have to continue to encourage people to challenge issues that they don't think are correct.
Right. So I know there was also an issue in my hometown, PG County, Maryland, as well as I read about the same issue happening in Florida, where in the minority community, people were, African Americans were turned away from being able to vote because of, they said that there was a lack of ballots, like they ran out of ballots, so people weren't able to vote because of just lack of preparation.
Right.
Obviously, up here in New Haven, I didn't hear about any issues that happening, but what you had to say about that issue, in just in terms of people kind of, in my opinion, deliberately making it a problem for black people to vote?
Well, I think there's an old saying that says about conspiracies, especially as it relates to government, that anybody who believes in a government conspiracy has never worked in government. So there's I think some of this is I'll say it politely, some of this is just inadequate preparation. People were not prepared, and we did have a similar issue here. People were not prepared for the turnout because they're using past performance to predict the current turnout, and they were off, and that happens. We did have a situation here where there were places where we ran out of ballots, but we had more ballots. But the problem is that creates a delay, and you have to have people that are willing to actually wait until we ship the ballots to the new polling place. Now, fortunately for us, New Haven, just 21 square miles. It's not that big. It doesn't take us that long to get there. But in other places where the geography is much more spread out, it can take a lot longer for that to happen. And this happened in New York, where the machines were jamming, and people left. And we don't know, if they came back or not. But elections can come down to, we still have elections across the country that are going to runoffs right now. Elections can come down to 1 or 2 votes. You really want to make sure that the things you can control are handled. And preparation for large turnout is something that the professionals that are associated with this, we just have to do better at doing. I had this exact conversation around preparation for large turnout with people who were at City Hall in this 100-person line. That was, it ended up being 800 people over the course of the day, but it was about 100 at a time over each hour that were there. And I had a interesting exchange with a Yale law student who was very disappointed that it was taking so long. And it was all I could tell her, which was, look, we base this on past elections. That's all we have to go on. And she said, well, you clearly were off. And I said, you're right. You're right. There's nothing really we can say about that. We were not prepared for this many people to be here on this day for this purpose. And that's on us. There's a responsibility on the voter too, which I said to her, which is that you all knew that you could have registered a week and a half ago when the deadline was, and you would have been able to vote. So we have to do a better job of pushing that as well, so that you're not in this situation. But yeah, I think you need to be prepared for all the voters that you have registered, right? There should be, there's nothing wrong with having a ballot available for every voter that you have on the list. That way you don't run out of ballots. It's not that, it's paper. It's really not that complicated. But the practice in the past has been to do a certain statistical percentage of the voters and base it on what the past few elections have turned out. And so you prepare that way. But when you start getting this energy that we had around these midterm elections this year, you have to adjust. You have to adjust on the fly. And not just in PG County, not just in New Haven, not just in New York, all around the country, Florida, like you said, all around the country, there were issues around this. And it can seem from the outside that there's actually a constructive, planned effort to somehow, by the officials, to somehow make sure that there's not enough ballots or the wait is too long. Generally, my experience with that is that that's not been the case. There are other things that I have that I'm more supportive of people believing that officials are doing things to dissuade votes. But in terms of things like that, like running out of ballots and that, I think that's just poor planning. And it happened everywhere. We're sensitive to it because that's what we're in tune with. But my guess is that if we checked around the country, we would find it in communities of all types.
Right. Well, that's great. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
Vote. Register to vote. Register now to vote, so I don't have to see you on election day at City Hall. I want to see you at your polling place on City Hall, not at election day. Run for office. That's important too, to get the issues that you care about out there. And if you have suggestions, send them into your local officials, your local elected officials. They're just regular people, just like you. So if you have ideas, there's nothing, they don't know them unless you share them.
Very true. Well, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Appreciate you joining us today.
All right, thank you.